The first unit in this course deals with intermediate Excel skills, and we're going to begin by talking about one of the most important and foundational concepts in Excel, cell referencing. One of the reasons we have spreadsheet software is to be able to do calculations that reference values in other cells. And to save a lot of time, you're going to be copying and pasting formulas you create. Knowing how referencing works will allow you to ensure that you copy exactly what you intend to. Let's start with relative referencing, which is the default type of referencing in Excel. When you copy a formula that uses relative references, that reference will automatically adjust based on the position where you paste the formula. In other words, by default, if I copy a formula like this one cell to the right, it will no longer reference cell A1. It will reference B1. If instead I copy it down, it will reference cell A2. In other words, a relative reference will continuously change based on the location where you copy your formula. What if instead you want your formula to always refer to a specific cell? You don't want the reference to ever change. In that case, you would use absolute referencing. To implement absolute referencing, you need to put dollar signs in front of both a cell's letter and number. These dollar signs are technically termed referencing operators, but I like to call them anchors. They anchor your reference to cell A1, and no matter where you copy and paste that formula, it is not going to change. There will be times when you want to use some form of a mixed reference, where you want either the rows or the columns to be able to change, but not the counterpart. In this case, you would place a single anchor or dollar sign in front of the part of the cell you want to lock in place. For the first example, the anchor is in front of the letter A, meaning that while the reference will change as I copy up and down, the column is locked in place. Alternatively, the last example puts a single anchor in front of the 1, which refers to row 1. The reference will thus be allowed to change moving left to right, but it is fixed to that first row. Let's see how this works in practice, so please open the file associated with this lecture video. Let's start with relative referencing. In the top left corner of this box, I'm going to start a formula by typing the equals sign, and then I'm simply going to type A1 in order to reference that cell. One nice thing that Excel does for us is it color codes cell references. It's made the text of my formula blue, and it's highlighted the border of the actual cell in the same color. I hit enter, and just like you'd expect, it returns alpha 1. Now this was a relative reference because I didn't change anything. This is the default option. As a result, if I copy this formula to the right, it now pulls data from the cells to the right of the original one I referenced. You can also copy formulas by clicking and dragging the fill handle. Let's try this again, but this time using an absolute reference. I'm going to put dollar signs in front of both the A and the 1. Again, these anchors are going to lock in both the column and the row. So now if I copy this formula to the right or left, up and down, it's always going to reference cell A1. Now sometimes we only want one element fixed, so we use a mixed reference. In this first example, I want the row to be fixed. So think to yourself, if you don't want the row to change, where do you need to put the dollar sign? Well, if rows are represented with numbers, we're going to put the dollar sign in front of the number 1. But better yet, before you and I copy this formula to the right, what is going to happen? Well, since the reference is allowed to move across columns, we are going to pick up the cells to the right. But if I copy the formula and drag it down, the numbers do not change. Let's do this one last time, but now we'll fix the column. One more thing to point out, after you've typed in or clicked on a cell to reference, you can also hit the F4 key to cycle through the 4 various referencing options. Once I see the anchor is just in front of the A, I now know that my column is locked in, and this time copying the formula to the right doesn't change anything. But now we do get different numbers going down. Let's move on to the next sheet in our workbook to practice this. The context for this example is that we're trying to generate a forecast of net income through the end of the year. But we want this forecast to be flexible to different assumptions about both a growth rate as well as the tax rate. Who knows what the future brings? So we want to look at different scenarios that are described in these questions below. So let's suppose we've got some basic financial statement data for the month of January, sales through net income, and up here we have some inputs for our forecasting model. Per these instructions, we are told to assume that sales, cost of goods sold, and operating expenses are going to increase each month according to the growth rate. We will then calculate tax expense as operating income multiplied by the tax rate. So before launching into this exercise, let's take a step back and think about what we will be referencing in our forecast and what things we want to move as we copy our formulas to the right, in addition to what things we want to stay put. For each subsequent month, we are going to want to be able to reference cells immediately to the left of a given line item. But if we want to reference our model inputs for these calculations, those seem like things we'd want to make an absolute reference to. So for sales in February, I want to make a relative reference to the sales amount in January and multiply that by 1 plus the growth rate. I'll do an open parenthesis, 1 plus, and we'll reference the growth rate here in cell C4. Now, I'm first going to demonstrate the wrong way of doing things. Don't you do this. But if I leave my formula as is, we might get the correct answer for sales in February. But as I copy this formula to the right, we keep getting the same number over and over. And that's because, as a relative reference, we're no longer referencing cell C4 for our growth rate. It keeps moving to the right and picking up all these zeros. So let's fix that. In February, I'm going to click on my formula, the reference to cell C4. I'm going to hit the F4 key, which automatically puts those dollar signs in front of both the letter and the number. I'll hit enter. And now if I drag this revised formula to the right, we now have the correct numbers. Now we could repeat this for each line item individually, but as it turns out, if we just leave these relative references as is and drag it down all the way through operating income, we're good to go. The last thing we have to do is calculate tax expense, which the instructions indicated was operating income multiplied by the tax rate. I'm going to start with a minus sign here just to keep a consistent format, negative numbers for these expenses. I'm going to say operating income multiplied by the tax rate. Again, hitting F4 once because I want an absolute reference to that tax rate cell. That completes that line of the table. All that's left then is to calculate net income. The sum of operating income minus this tax expense, and there we go. We're now prepared to answer these questions. For example, given the default model inputs, in what month do sales surpass $1 million? Well, we can look through this and say, it happens in July. Given the default model inputs, what will net income equal in December? Well, we can make a reference to that cell. Q14, we can pull that up. Total tax expense for the year, we might want to do a equals sum and reference all of those tax expense items during the year. We now have answers for these first three questions. That's great. But the beauty of what we've done is we've allowed our forecasting model to be flexible to different assumptions with these model inputs. So in question 4, we're going to change the growth rate to 3% and then see in what month sales surpass $1 million. So going up to cell C4, I'm going to change this to 3%, and it has updated our entire forecast for the year. Of course, our answers to the prior questions, they now reference different things. We no longer have that beautiful green fill in those cells. That's fine, don't worry about it. But now the month in which we surpass $1 million in sales, that's changed to November. Well, what if it was a growth rate of 8%? Let's change that. Still default tax rate of 20%. What is net income in December? I mean, honestly, we could have just looked at question 2 because we're making the same reference there. Lastly, given a growth rate of 4% and a tax rate of 25%, we update those amounts. What is total tax expense for the whole year? Well, I bet you it's going to be this number right here, but we'll put it in this box, equals the sum of all of these line items. And there we go. Now we've demonstrated the beauty of referencing to be able to quickly copy formulas that are flexible to changing assumptions.